Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking you inside a place very few people ever get to see, CECOT. It's the world's largest and most secure prison, and it's right in the heart of El Salvador.
Most people just see the headlines, but we're going to do a real deep dive today.
Yeah, exactly. We're going way beyond those news reports. We're using a fascinating YouTube documentary by Ruhi Çenet as our main source. It features incredible footage from inside the prison and even an interview with an inmate.
It's a pretty unique look into this really controversial facility.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to make us think about justice and punishment in a whole new way.
For sure. Okay, so to set the stage a little bit, El Salvador has had this massive problem with gangs.
Mm-hmm.
It actually had the highest homicide rates in the world for a while.
Right.
And then in 2022, President Nayib Bukele came in and he cracked down hard on this. He ended up arresting over 70,000 suspected gang members in just 16 months.
Yeah, it was a huge crackdown, and that's where CECOT comes in.
Right.
They built this 410-acre mega prison specifically to house all those new inmates. And it's designed to be completely inescapable.
Yeah, you see it in the documentary. It's intense. Towering walls, electric fences, 19 watchtowers, and there's this constant surveillance everywhere.
Oh yeah, they're watching your every move. It's almost like they're trying to break the inmates psychologically even before they set foot inside.
And even the documentary crew experienced that. I mean, they had to go through all these security measures just to get in there to film.
Oh yeah.
Body scans, searches, signal jammers, the whole thing. They even had to surrender all their belongings.
Right.
It really shows you the lengths they go to control literally every single aspect of that prison.
Yeah. And there's this one interesting thing they mentioned about the host of the documentary. He actually didn't wear a mask.
Oh, really?
Unlike the guards. Yeah. He said he did that because he wanted to maintain eye contact with the inmates. Makes you wonder, even in an environment like that, is there some sliver of humanity they're trying to preserve?
That's a really interesting point. It kind of makes you question the whole purpose of the system, But let's talk about what life is actually like inside CECOT.
Yeah.
Because the documentary doesn't sugarcoat anything.
No, it doesn't.
We're talking about cells crammed with 80 to 150 inmates. Each inmate only has half a square meter of personal space.
That's crazy.
And there's zero contact with the outside world. I mean, no visits, no calls, nothing.
Nothing. It's total isolation. It's the conditions are specifically designed to punish.
Yeah.
They barely have running water. They get basically no bedding, and the lights are constantly on.
So you can't even sleep.
Right. It's almost impossible to sleep. And they only get 1 hour of outdoor time a week.
Seriously?
Yeah, and even that's heavily supervised.
It's just, it's hard to even fathom what it'd be like to live like that. And another thing that really stood out in the documentary was just how young a lot of these inmates are. I mean, some of them are barely in their 20s.
Yeah, it's pretty shocking.
And they've already been convicted of some really serious crimes. Some of them are even responsible for hundreds of deaths. It makes you wonder how they ended up on that path.
Right.
But then the documentary kind of starts to answer that question when they talk about the inmates' tattoos.
Oh, yeah. The tattoos.
It's they're a visual language of gang life,
Yeah, like a whole other language.
Spiderwebs mean imprisonment. Teardrops mean lives taken. Devil horns show allegiance to the gang. It's kind of chilling to see those markings, those tattoos, and think about what they really represent.
It's heavy stuff.
One that really stood out to me was the Laugh Now, Cry Later masks.
Oh, yeah. Those are intense.
What do you think that says about their mindset?
I think it's this really complex mix of bravado, trying to look tough, but also this haunting awareness that there are going to be consequences.
Yeah.
They knew they were headed down a dark path, but just couldn't or wouldn't change course.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
And then we haven't even talked about the isolation cells.
Oh, yeah.
Those are a whole other level of harsh.
It's complete darkness, minimal light, absolutely no stimulation. It's just the epitome of solitary confinement.
And what does that do to a person?
Right.
Psychologically?
Exactly. You have to wonder about the long-term effects of that kind of extreme isolation. I mean,
Yeah.
Is this really about rehabilitation, or is it simply about breaking them down completely?
That's a really good question. It's something we're going to have to keep in mind as we go forward. But before we get into that, we have to talk about one of the inmates featured in the documentary. His nickname is Psycho. Yeah. He's this high-ranking gang member who spent 34 years in the criminal world. And his story is It's both horrifying, but honestly kind of heartbreaking.
Really?
Yeah.
So what makes his story so interesting?
What makes this story so compelling is that it really sheds light on the cycle of violence that that traps so many young people in El Salvador. I mean, he joined a gang when he was just 11 years old.
Wow, just a kid.
And he was looking for things he wasn't getting at home, you know, like a sense of belonging and a father figure he didn't have.
Oh, wow.
And from there, it just spiraled. I mean, his life spiraled into this unimaginable violence.
Yeah.
He ended up claiming over 50 lives.
That's hard to even imagine.
I know. But the thing is, even in this brutal prison, he expresses this like genuine regret. He talks about missing his son, seeking forgiveness, wanting to find God. It was actually pretty powerful to see.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of places, you know, humanity can still exist.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if true rehabilitation is really possible, even for someone who's committed such, you know, horrific acts.
Yeah. That's a question I keep asking myself. Okay, let's change gears a little bit here and talk about the impact CECOT has had on the country.
Okay.
It's definitely controversial. There's no doubt about that. But the documentary did point out that since they opened CECOT, El Salvador's homicide rate has plummeted. It went from a staggering 104 per 100,000 people to just 2.4.
That's a huge decrease.
I know, right? But it makes you wonder, is this peace, you know, is it achieved at too high a cost? Is this a sustainable solution? Or are we just delaying the problem?
It's a tough question, and honestly, I don't know the answer. But it's definitely a question we need to consider. And what about, what about all the people who might have been wrongly imprisoned in this massive crackdown?
Oh, right.
With no contact with the outside world, how could they possibly prove their innocence?
That's a really scary thought.
It is.
It makes you think about, you know, the long-term consequences of an approach like this. I mean, are we creating a society that's ruled by fear, or is this really a necessary step towards lasting peace? It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. It's a really complex situation, and there aren't any easy answers. But that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating.
Yeah, it really does.
It forces us to think about things we may not want to think about.
Yeah.
It challenges our assumptions. You know, it makes us confront some really uncomfortable truths about justice and about punishment.
Well said. We've just scratched the surface here. We've taken a look inside CECOT, heard from Psycho, and started to look at the impact this has had on El Salvador's crime rate. But we still have a lot to discuss.
We do.
So stay with us. We'll be right back.
So we were talking about CECOT's impact on the homicide rate, and it's like pretty dramatic. But I'm wondering, is there a chance that this crackdown is just pushing criminal activity underground, you know, out of sight, out of mind? Oh, that's definitely a real concern. It's like if you don't deal with the root causes of gang violence, you're not really fixing the problem.
Right, you're just kind of putting a Band-Aid on it.
Exactly. You got to think about the social and economic issues that lead people to join gangs in the first place.
Yeah.
If you don't address those, it's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. So essentially, it's possible that this whole thing just creates this like temporary illusion of safety.
It could.
Yeah.
And then what happens when all these gang members are eventually released? You know, they go back into the same environment that created the problem in the first place.
Right, so then what?
That's why a lot of experts are pushing for a more holistic approach, you know. Instead of just focusing on law enforcement, they say you need social programs that target the root causes of gang involvement.
Okay, so what kind of programs are we talking about here?
Well, think about it this way. You got to give at-risk youth real alternatives to gang life. So things like educational opportunities, job training, mentorship programs, stuff like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Give them something to strive for, a reason to believe in a different future.
Exactly. But what about the people who are already inside CECOT? Is there any focus on rehabilitation there? Or is it just punishment?
Yeah, is there any attempt to like break the cycle?
It's hard to say. The documentary doesn't really go into a lot of detail about that. They did show, they showed one scene with a preacher, like giving religious instruction to the inmates.
Oh, okay.
But it wasn't clear, you know, if that's a regular thing or if it's actually effective.
I mean, is religious instruction alone enough to really change someone's life, especially after everything they've been through?
I don't think so. If you want to talk about true rehabilitation, you got to have more than that. You need education, job training, psychological counseling, the whole 9 yards. You got to give them the tools they need to actually reintegrate into society.
And help them deal with the trauma they've experienced, both from their past and from being inside CECOT.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But, even if they do get all that, you still have to consider the psychological toll of just being in that environment.
Right, we talked about all that before. The constant surveillance, the lack of contact with the outside world, hardly any time outdoors. Like, how does a person even cope with that?
It's tough, man. That kind of prolonged isolation and boredom can do some serious damage to a person's psyche. It can lead to despair, depression, anxiety, even increased aggression.
It's like you're denying them basic human needs.
Exactly. And, when you have that kind of situation with so much power concentrated in the hands of the guards, there's always a risk of human rights abuses happening.
Behind closed doors, yeah.
And the lack of transparency makes it even worse. There's no way to know for sure what's going on inside.
Yeah.
It's really crucial to have independent monitors, people who can go in and make sure the inmates are being treated humanely.
That's a good point. Okay, so let's say, for the sake of argument, that CECOT isn't the ideal solution here. What are some alternatives? How can we reduce gang violence without resorting to such extreme measures?
Well, there are plenty of countries that have had success tackling gang violence by taking a more multifaceted approach. Instead of just locking people up, they try to create a safer environment overall.
So it's like a more preventative approach.
Yeah, exactly. For example, some places have these community policing programs where law enforcement works directly with the people who live in these neighborhoods, to build trust and address the concerns of the community.
So it's less about us versus them, more about working together.
Right. And other successful initiatives focus on providing economic opportunities in impoverished communities. They set up youth centers that offer positive activities and even work with former gang members to help them reintegrate into society.
And those former gang members could even serve as mentors for at-risk youth, right? Like, hey, I've been there, I know what it's like, but there's a better way.
Exactly. It's all about breaking the cycle, creating this ripple effect of positive change. And it's not just about reducing crime. It's about creating a more just and equitable society overall.
Right, so everyone has a chance to thrive. Going back to Psycho for a minute, his story really emphasizes how many of these gang members are drawn into that life when they're still just kids.
Yeah, it's pretty tragic. They're just looking for a place to belong, someone to look up to, and gangs exploit that.
They offer this twisted sense of family and belonging, but it comes at a huge cost.
A huge cost. And a lot of these kids, they come from broken homes, poverty, communities where violence is just a normal part of life. They're desperate for something to believe in, and gangs offer them that, but it's a lie.
So it all comes back to addressing those root causes. If we can change the conditions that breed gang violence, maybe we can break the cycle for future generations.
That's the hope. And it's not an easy task. It's going to take a lot of work, a lot of commitment from everyone involved.
It's a huge challenge. I mean, can we really change patterns of violence that have been so deeply ingrained for so long?
It's not easy, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But it is possible. There are communities all over the world that have done it. They've managed to reduce crime, improve people's lives, create real lasting change.
That's encouraging to hear. So what can we learn from those success stories? What's the secret sauce?
Well, the first thing is that it takes buy-in from everyone. The government, law enforcement, community leaders, even former gang members. Everyone has to be on board.
Okay, so it's about building trust, working together towards a common goal.
Exactly. But it's also important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Every community is different. Every situation is unique.
So you have to be adaptable, flexible.
And patient. Changing these kinds of behaviors takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. There are going to be setbacks along the way, but you got to stay focused on the long-term goal.
Keep your eye on the prize. The documentary mentioned that the whole world is watching to see what happens in El Salvador. Is CECOT the future? Or will it end up being a cautionary tale?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Only time will tell.
Okay.
But it's definitely a pivotal moment, not just for El Salvador, but for any country that's struggling with this issue.
Yeah, the stakes are high. It's definitely something we need to keep following closely. Speaking of things we need to pay attention to, let's talk about the media's role in all of this.
Oh yeah, that's a big one. The way the media covers this story can have a huge impact on public opinion, which then influences policy decisions.
There was that scene in the documentary, where they showed the inmates being paraded in front of the cameras.
Oh, yeah.
Their faces were just full of fear and humiliation. I mean, it's powerful imagery, but it also made me wonder about the ethics of, exploiting their vulnerability like that.
Yeah, it's a tough call. On the one hand, you want to show people the reality of gang violence, the consequences of choosing that path. But on the other hand, You don't want to sensationalize it. You have to treat everyone with a certain level of respect and dignity.
Even those who've done terrible things.
Exactly. And you got to avoid those simplistic narratives, like not every gang member is a monster and not every victim is innocent. It's way more complicated than that. And the media has a responsibility to present it in an honest and nuanced way.
Yeah, it's not black and white. It's a whole spectrum of gray.
Right. And, the documentary also highlighted the dangers that journalists face when they cover this issue, especially in a place like El Salvador, where freedom of the press is often under threat.
That's a good point. It's easy to forget that those journalists are putting themselves at risk to bring us this information.
They are. And they play a crucial role in holding those in power accountable. They're like the watchdogs of democracy. Without a free and independent press, we're all in trouble.
Yeah. They're the ones who shine a light on the truth, ask the tough questions, help us understand what's really going on. Their work is so important.
It is. So, after all that, what are your biggest takeaways so far? What's sticking with you the most?
Yeah, there's just so much to process, from those really stark images of life inside CECOT to all the ethical questions surrounding Bukele's crackdown. It's obvious that this isn't just about one prison.
You're so right. It's like CECOT is this sort of microcosm of all these bigger issues, right? Like gang violence and poverty and just the whole struggle to find solutions that actually work. I think what I keep coming back to is can you really achieve lasting peace using these kinds of extreme measures?
It makes you think about, what are we really giving up here? Are we sacrificing individual rights and due process just for the sake of security? And then what are the long-term consequences of that kind of trade-off? I don't know. It's heavy stuff. And I can't stop thinking about Psycho and his story. He's he represents both the brutality of that whole world and this tiny glimmer of hope that things can change. It reminds you that even people who've done truly awful things can still feel regret and maybe even find redemption.
And that's what makes the whole conversation about rehabilitation so important, right? Is CECOT really set up to help these guys turn their lives around? Or is it just about punishment and isolation? Honestly, I finished that documentary wondering if they're doing enough to give those inmates the tools they need to re-enter society.
Yeah, because the goal is just to break them down psychologically what's going to happen when they get out. I mean, it seems like that could actually backfire and make the problem even worse.
For sure. If you're only focused on punishment, and not on dealing with those underlying issues that lead people to gangs in the first place, then yeah, it's not going to be a long-term solution. You got to give these guys education, job training, mental health support, all of that. Without it, it's just so much harder to break free from that cycle of violence.
And then there's the whole issue of what happens if innocent people get swept up in these mass arrests. With no contact with the outside world, how can they even try to prove they don't belong there?
It's a terrifying thought.
Yeah.
And that's exactly why the lack of transparency around CECOT is so worrying.
Yeah.
Without some kind of independent oversight, the potential for abuse is it's huge.
It's this whole thing forces us to look in the mirror, what are we really willing to sacrifice for the sake of safety, and how much are we willing to pay for it? It's a really tough question to wrestle with.
No doubt. It's a question that every country dealing with gang violence has to face. And there are no easy answers. But I think what we can learn from other countries is that just focusing on punishment, it doesn't usually work in the long run. The approaches that seem to be most successful are the ones that really tackle those root causes of gang violence. The social and economic factors that push people in that direction in the first place.
So it's about investing in communities, right?
Yeah.
Giving people real opportunities, showing them that there's hope for a better future.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that real justice isn't just about accountability. It's also about compassion and understanding.
Yeah.
And believing that people can actually change.
That's a good point. Man, this deep dive has been, it's been a real eye-opener for me. I feel like I'm thinking about these issues in a whole new way.
That's what we like to hear. That's the whole point of digging deeper into these topics. Challenge our assumptions, look at things from different angles.
I gotta say, though, I'm walking away with more questions than answers. But but maybe that's okay. I definitely want to learn more about how different countries are tackling this issue. And I hope all of you listening out there feel the same way.
Absolutely. The more we understand the problem, the better equipped we'll be to find solutions that actually work.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, folks, We've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone inside CECOT, we've heard the stories of the people living there, and we started to explore what this all means for El Salvador and the rest of the world. It's a complicated, challenging topic, and there's still so much to learn. But for now, we're going to wrap things up here.
Yeah, but remember, the conversation doesn't have to end here. Keep asking questions, keep learning, keep engaging with these issues. The more we talk about this stuff, the closer we'll get to a future where violence isn't the answer.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic to explore together. Until then, keep those minds engaged.